A federal appeals court has indefinitely blocked Judge Breyer's order to put Gavin Newsom back in control of the National Guard. The three-judge panel, which included 2 Trump and 1 Biden appointee, was unanimous. So 3-0 against Gavin Newsom. Let's get into part of the opinion. So this is the statute that gives the president authority, is Federal Code 12406. And the statute provides whenever the United States or any of the Commonwealths or possessions is invaded or is in danger of invasion by a foreign nation, there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, or the president is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States, the president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. Orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states. And that's very important, that language, through the governors of the state. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Or in the case of the District of Columbia, through the commanding general of the National Guard of the District of Columbia. So let's see what else they had to say. They go on to say the protesters threw objects, including Molotov cocktails, and vandalized property. According to the declaration submitted by defendants, those activities significantly impeded the ability of federal officers to execute the laws, affording appropriate deference to the president's determination. Conclude that he will likely acted within his authority in federalizing the National Guard under 10 U.S.C. 12406. So that's the statute. Here's the parameters. Basically, if it comes down to the federal government cannot enact laws, or it makes it very difficult to enact laws, or they need to quell a rebellion, then the president can call up the National Guard. He can, quote what they say, federalize the National Guard for the use of the commander-in-chief. And it goes on to say, assuming, and this is one of my favorite legal words, if you ever want to use this at like a cocktail party or something like that. It says, assuming arguendo that plaintiffs were likely to prevail on their claim that defendants violated the statute's procedural requirement, the proper remedy would be injunctive relief tailored to defendants' failure to issue the order through the governor, not an injunction prohibiting the president from exercising his lawful authority to call up the National Guard. All right, let's break that down for a quick second. Remember, I said in that statute, it said through the National Guard or through the governor's office. That's one of those things in the legal world where you get down to the nitty gritty of what does through mean as opposed to by the governor. So Gavin Newsom's whole argument is that President Trump didn't have the authority, or he didn't do this correctly, because he basically just went ahead and did it. So what happened was on June 7th, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, issued a memorandum to what they call the Adjutant General, who is the guy who is in charge of the National Guard here in California, works in the governor's office. He is part of the governor's office. They issued a memorandum that they were calling up the National Guard to protect with the federal personnel and to protect federal buildings because there was all these issues. So when that happened, the Adjutant General read it and said, okay, I'm just going to cede my authority to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. That's what we're supposed to do here. President Trump took over, and that became part of the issue. That will probably be a part of this larger lawsuit, because it really comes down to, as unsexy as it sounds, it really is going to come down to procedure and whether or not it was supposed to be through the governor's office, which, what does that mean? Or does it have to be by the governor? And that's what I think it's all going to come down to. So Newsom is suing over the fact that his authority was basically usurped by the President of the United States under this federal code. So let's go on to the next part. Goes on to say, we also note that California's concerns about escalation and interference with local law enforcement at present are too speculative. We do not know whether future protests will grow due to the deployment of the National Guard. One of the arguments that Newsom made was, well, calling up the National Guard is going to cause and further flame a lot of tensions in LA that's already kind of bubbling over. So calling up the National Guard made it worse. If you remember, basically after Trump called up the National Guard and federalized the National Guard, they were all on TV. Newsom, Karen Bass, Democratic congressmen, senators, all of them were on all these news networks saying he's inflamed the tensions by calling up the National Guard. He's made it worse by calling up the National Guard. They tried to make that part of their lawsuit. They tried to say, well, by him doing this, this was the harm. By him, this is the harm that we need emergency TRO relief for, is we need the National Guard back. Otherwise, it's going to continue to inflame these protests, and it's going to get worse and worse. So the president made it worse, not better. What the court here is saying is way too speculative. That is way too speculative for you to say that the National Guard was the reason that there were these riots and protests. Again, the court didn't really take that into consideration. They're looking at the statute and they're applying the facts to the statute. And I want to take a step back really quick. Where we are at in the process, there was a quick TRO in the trial court, or what they call the district court and federal court. It was then upheld that President Trump could use it. They appealed it, or I'm sorry, reverse that. The district court said that President Trump had to return the National Guard to Governor Newsom. They appealed it, went back to President Trump. Now this is part of that appeal. The appeal said, nope, President Trump gets to keep the National Guard under his authority for now. And that's where we're at. So the case hasn't heard its whole way out. It's probably going to be a while until we hear the actual what happens here. Maybe it just gets dismissed. Who knows? I wouldn't put it past Gavin Newsom to quietly dismiss this and go away so he can stop suffering so many losses. But that's where we're at in this process. And that was part of their argument, was there's irreparable harm that California is going to suffer if we don't get our National Guard back. So I wanted to talk about this really quick, because Gavin Newsom, the master politician, the master snake oil salesman, had to spin it. He had to spin what was a clear loss into his favor. And, I read the entire opinion, made these highlights, and I'm showing them to you. I read the whole opinion, and it is pretty conclusively a win for President Trump, not for Gavin Newsom. And somehow he managed to make it all about him winning. So quickly after this was dropped, after the court order, almost within literal minutes, Gavin Newsom was posting all over social media, taking a victory lap about how he had won, about how they had stood up to President Trump, that he is no king. As it goes on to say, the court rightly rejected Trump's claim that he can do whatever he wants with the National Guard and not have to explain himself to a court. The president is not a king and is not above the law. We will press forward with our challenge to President Trump's authoritarian use of U.S. military soldiers against citizens. Here's the issue there, old noodles. You lost. The statute is pretty clear. 10 U.S.C. 12406 says the president can, when it makes it hard to enact federal laws, and in this case, there were the ICE raids going on. They were trying to conduct these immigration law enforcement raids or arrests. They were trying to do what they were supposed to do or what they were ordered to do. These protests and riots were making it hard to do. They were throwing objects at a lot of the federal law enforcement, Molotov cocktails, concrete, all of this stuff. So what did the president do? Under that statute, he said, I'm going to federalize the National Guard and I'm going to protect our assets and our people. And that's what he has the right to do. And the case goes on to say that it's likely the defendants, in this case, President Trump, are going to win, right? That's why they upheld this, because based on the standards of an injunction or temporary restraining order, what they call TRO, it's likely the defendants are going to win because they don't really see what the argument is here. The president has the authority. There's the statute. And again, sure, they can get into the weeds of should it be through the governor's office or should it be by the governor? Is that who they should coordinate with? And I think they're probably going to argue this whole thing about the memorandum went to the adjutant general. The Attorney General stepped aside and said, okay, now the National Guard is yours. You can do what you want with them. And Gavin Newsom didn't like that. He didn't like people questioning his authority. He didn't like Trump coming in and taking his National Guard away from him. So what was the only thing he could do? He could sue. He's making this whole stink about this. And then he goes on to social media and he posts stuff like this that is a blatant lie that he did not win. And I don't see anywhere in this summary or in the case opinion where it said the court rightly rejected Trump's claim that he can do whatever he wants with the National Guard. I didn't get that anywhere from the entire opinion that he can do whatever he wants. Trump just followed what the statute said, and he did what the statute said, and the court said, yeah, he did what the statute allows him to do. We're going to give him the deferential treatment of this is what the president can do under federal law, and that's the end of it. And we're just going to keep this stay in place, and President Trump can keep the National Guard under his authority until this is all kind of worked out. But what's really kind of the saddest thing is, while I know people who are watching this or are listening might be celebrating that Gavin Newsom got another loss in the Ninth Circuit at the hands of President Trump, I will say this. We should all be a little disappointed that all of these lawsuits are being paid for with our tax dollars. So all these monumental losses that, remember, there was a story a little bit ago that got about the tariffs, and they sued about the tariffs and they got kicked out of court immediately because they didn't check something as simple as jurisdiction. Like Rob Bonta, the top attorney, supposedly the top attorney in all of California, our attorney general, didn't figure out whether jurisdiction was proper or not. Now he's suffering more losses over the National Guard. But this is all part of a $50 million taxpayer-funded fund that they put aside specifically just to sue President Trump. So I think the biggest point that you should really be upset about is that he keeps losing and we keep paying for his losses. And this is going to keep going. And whatever he can do, he's going to keep suing over and over again. So